Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's recital of Gesang Plus, as it might be called. I'm George Kennaway. I don't know how much is said about me in the programme, but I should point out that I'm also a trustee of Leeds Leader, which I'm very pleased and proud to be. So acting with that hat on, please support Leeds Leader. Financially is always good, but physically with your presence at concerts is even better. So thank you. I'm going to talk around Gesang. I don't want to try and plough through every song because that would only spoil your enjoyment of what will be a wonderful concert. But I'm going to talk first of all about the origins of this work. I'm not calling it a song cycle for reasons which will become obvious. In 1828, Schubert's health was declining. He'd been ill for some years. But as Richard Capel said in 1928, the mind that conceived this music was never more alert or inventive. In spite of his worsening health, he was very productive at this time. In 1828, the court doctor had suggested that he moved in with his brother Ferdinand. Ferdinand was a good person to live with because he lived in a cleaner part of Vienna. Unfortunately, his house was damper, and in the long run, that damp didn't do Schubert any favours at all. But he was still able to write. In that last year, apart from what became Gesang, he wrote his last three piano sonatas, the C major string quintet, the Shepherd on the Rock, the E-flat piano trio, that's the second of the two, and many other songs. In his last days, in early November 1828, he was often delirious, but when he was lucid, he continued to correct the proofs of Winterreise Part 2, which was published the following year after his death. We know Gesang from Schubert's own manuscript. He wrote it out in full, in one session, in one book of manuscript paper. He wrote out the Ralstop and Heine settings at one go. But he gave titles to the songs, but he didn't give the collection a title at all. It was just a string of pieces. He may well not have seen it as a single collection. He might have intended to publish two collections, one Ralstop and one Heine, because before he died, he just offered the Heine songs, along with some other works, to a Leipzig publisher, Heinrich Probst, in early October 1828. Probst had asked Schubert for some new works to publish, but nothing came of this. So he wasn't expecting to die anytime soon. He was working as normal, composing and dealing with publishers and checking proof copies. The manuscript of the songs is dated August 1828, but that's the date of the fair copy. It's not that fair, actually, but it's a lot better than some sketches. But some surviving sketches show that he began work on some of these songs earlier in that year. It's quite a tidy manuscript. It does have some corrections. It looks like it's been written out very quickly. But the later song, Die Taubenpost, which ends what we now call Gesang, which is dated October, is noticeably neater, not messier. So Schubert's main manuscript may look hasty, but it's not a race against death. He's just writing quickly, that's all. And he died on the 19th of November, 1828. Where did he find the poems? Well, I'll just talk a little bit about that. Chiefly, the more interesting but the worst poet is Ludwig Ralstop. He was a musician, he was a good pianist, he was a poet and a music critic. He was quite influential and popular as a critic and published in many German newspapers. His outspoken criticism of individuals landed him in prison twice. He was strongly in favour of German opera, but he was also quite conservative in his tastes. He didn't like Chopin. That was like dangerous modern music. And he said that Schumann, in his Kinderschänen, now, amateur pianists in the room, like me, will have played Kinderschänen. It's a harmless collection of nice little pieces. But Ralstop said that Kinderschänen, it was like Schumann had put a howling child on his piano and sought to give a realistic imitation of its sounds. Those were the days. You don't write criticism like that now. He also disliked Schubert's songs. He preferred simple songs, and he thought Schubert was awkward and he went on too long. A Russian writer called Nikolai Ogaryev had dinner with Ralstop in 1842. He called Ralstop an insufferable being, a dry critic who maintains that Schubert botched his verses, an insufferable Dummkopf. And accounts vary as to how Schubert got hold of the Ralstop poems. Ralstop tells us one version. He wanted Beethoven to write an opera with his Ralstop's words, but he didn't think he could just turn up on Beethoven's doorstep and say, "Oi, I've written this thing, write an opera." So he turned up with some songs as a sort of enticement. He brought what he says is, "Those of my lyrical products I considered the best ones to lay before Beethoven. Not the opera text, but 8 or 10 lyric poems. Perhaps one of them might happily inspire Beethoven to breathe into eternal tones the transitory emotion of his breast." And he carried the letters to Beethoven himself. He didn't give it to the post. He carried it himself because it's such an important matter. Beethoven said he liked the poems, apparently, but he did nothing with them. He didn't write an opera. End of story, as far as Ralstop and Beethoven are concerned. But Ralstop says that Beethoven gave the poems directly to Schubert. Imagine the honor, you're a second-rate poet in Vienna, and Beethoven gives your poems to Schubert to set to music. Well, that may not be true. Beethoven's unreliable biographer, Anton Schindler, says he gave them to Schubert after Beethoven's death in March 1827. And certainly Schubert didn't start writing the songs until after the spring of 1828, which suggests that Schindler on this occasion is actually more right than Ralstop. The Heine settings all use poems from a section of Heine's Buch der Lieder called Der Heimkehr, the Homecoming. That's a large collection of 83 poems and included in the much larger Buch der Lieder. The singer Karl von Schönstein, to whom Schöne Müllerin is dedicated, wrote in his memoirs, "When Schubert was still living at Schobers," that's before he moved to the damp house of his brother, "I found he had in his possession Heine's Buch der Lieder, which interested me very much. I asked him for it, and he let me have it, saying he didn't need it anymore. All the Heine songs in Schwanengesang are contained in this book, and the places where they're found are indicated by dog-eared leaves, probably done by Schubert himself." It's sometimes argued that the Heine songs are in the wrong order in Schwanengesang because they're in a different order from how they're printed in Heine's book. That's quite controversial because the only way of proving it is by internal analysis alone. There is no other evidence, and that's a very dodgy foundation to build any kind of argument on like this. And no one complains that he reordered the Ralstop songs. They just pick on the Heine ones. But sometimes it leads to a change in the sung order of the poems. As far as I know, Ian Bostridge is singing the conventional order. Middle of December, after Schubert had died, his brother sold the manuscript to the Viennese publisher Tobias Haslinger, along with the last 3 piano sonatas, of which Imogen Cooper is a famous performer. But Haslinger didn't like the piano sonatas, and he didn't publish them. And it took another 10 years before they came out with a different publisher in Vienna. But he liked Schwanengesang. He jumped up and down. He immediately advertised in the Wiener Zeitung to say that he'd bought the songs. And these were 14 songs in all, eventually published the next year. But some of the songs were performed before they were published. There was a Schubertiade at Joseph von Spaun's home. Spaun was a lifelong friend of Schubert and a financial supporter as well, just before Christmas. And the composer's friends gathered to hear the great singer Johann Michael Vogel sing Die Taubenpost and Der Doppelgänger. One of the people in that audience, Ludwig von Hartmann, another friend of Schubert's, said Der Doppelgänger was one of the blackest night pieces to be found among Schubert's songs. And that's someone who may not have known how Winterreise ends, but nonetheless, it's pretty extreme, as I'll demonstrate in a moment. Another friend of Schubert's, Anna Fröhlich, a singing teacher and pianist, who was also at Spann's Schubertiade, arranged a private concert at the end of January to raise money for a monument to Schubert. And then Taubenpost and Aufenthalt were performed so successfully they had to be encored. And Fröhlich later used the songs in her own teaching at the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde in Vienna. It's not clear what physical sheet music they used, because it hadn't been published yet. But almost certainly it was Schubert's manuscript which Haslinger let them use, because Anna Fröhlich's concert on the 30th of January, the advertisements announced that it was going to be published quite soon. And the very next day, Haslinger finally announced it was going to be published, and that's when we get the title Schwanengesang. It never appears in connection with this piece until the 31st of January 1829, which would have been Schubert's 32nd birthday. And Haslinger announced that this title was given to the last blossoms of Schubert's noble spirit, the compositions he wrote shortly before he left this world, which proclaim the consummate nature of his mastery. And he advertised for subscribers. So if you, as they say nowadays, pre-ordered, dreadful word, then you got a better deal. And other advertisements also called it his last work. And it's published that with, on the title page of the actual publication, it says Letztes Werk. In the Wiener Zeitung, where they advertised this, I looked in the rest of the issue. And as well as buying or pre-ordering Schwanengesang, you could buy pianos, you could buy quack medicine, you could buy wine, you could buy horses and carriages. You could read about who'd won lottery prizes, you could read the most recent court judgments, you could read international news, and you could read advertisements for ball dresses. And very near the advertisement, you could also buy a 12-piece dinner service in gilt porcelain. So these newspapers give a great cross-section of the liveliness of Viennese life at the time. It's a bit like surfing eBay today. Oh yes, here's some new songs by Schubert, I'll have that. Oh, here's a horse, I'll have that. It brings you down to earth. Haslinger had done pretty well out of song cycles. He'd done well out of Schöne Müllerin, he'd done well out of the first part of Winterreise, so he was very happy to get another one. He was going to publish it in 4 installments, but that would have raised more money. But he settled on 2 parts in the end. He'd already published the first part of Winterreise, and part 2 of Winterreise appeared in April 1829. Die Taubenpost is the elephant in the room, if I can mix the metaphors, written in different paper at a different time, stuck onto the manuscript probably by Haslinger himself, and therefore included in the group of songs. I don't use the word cycle. At the same time that Haslinger published this music, he published waltzes by the elder Strauss and by Lanner, operatic arrangements, piano music by Hummel, all sorts of other things. The operatic arrangements are quite good. At the same time he was publishing Schwanengesang, he was publishing an arrangement of Don Giovanni for 2 flutes, and an arrangement of the Barber of Seville for 2 violins. That's a very long evening. Whether you're playing, it's a long evening if you're playing, but it's a very long evening if you're listening. So I can't imagine, I want to see that music, but I don't want to necessarily hear it played. In October 1829, Gottfried Fink reviewed both Schwanengesang and the now complete Winterreise. And Gottfried Fink really got hold of the idea of the swan song. He said, "We see the swan resting under the shadows of the weeping willows and on the way to the nether regions. More than we complete the wintry journey with the forsaken wanderer." And he placed Schwanengesang higher than Winterreise. He said it was more genial, more controlled, more inventive, and more intimately felt. Schubert, he said, and this is very revealing, he said, Schubert found neither the time nor the inclination to wander from the proper path of sincere truths into any uncharted byways. And I think here he really is thinking of the end of Winterreise. That's an uncharted byway if ever there was one. But he was a bit scared by this. The reason he liked Schwanengesang is that it ends happily. There is der Doppelganger, one of the most terrifying things in Schubert, but then there is die Taubenpost, which makes everyone feel happy again, and the nice, wealthy bourgeois can go home feeling quite comfortable and good about life. That's my view, not Fink's. He also said that the accompaniment is anything but easy, which I will demonstrate in a moment, and that the singer and pianist should rehearse well together. Good advice. He also says that he recommended Schwanengesang to all more serious amateurs, even when in many numbers the music is not always light and entertaining. From them, each individual certainly can and will select what is precisely to his taste. This is very important. Song cycles that were called song cycles were not played as such. And Schwanengesang is not actually a song cycle, technically speaking. But whether they're called that or not, it's well later into the 19th century before people think you have to sing the whole thing at one go. Earlier on, and Natasha Logus has done a lot of research on this, people would sing selections. They would sing things in a different order. They would leave bits out, all sorts of things like that. So this works very well for the top end, as it were, of the amateur market in Vienna, who will pick and choose what they like to play and sing. Taubenpost, written by Anton Seidl, he's another relatively second-rate poet who's a rather more interesting person. He was a very superficial writer of prose and poetry, huge amounts of each. A pushy person who irritated Schubert no end by nagging him to make an opera. Have we heard this before? To make an opera to his words and set his songs to music. And he didn't always agree with that, of course. It's been criticized for being remarkably cheerful after Der Doppelganger, but the sudden contrast of Ralstop's Abschied with Heinz der Atlas is at least as dramatic. Taubenpost restores what you might call the bürgerliche atmosphere. There's nothing like that at the end of Winterreise. There's nothing to send you out whistling a cheerful tune at the end of Winterreise. In modern times, Taubenpost has been it's been suggested by the editors of the Neue Schubert Ausgabe that you should think long and hard before you include it, because Schubert didn't include it. But most singers pay no attention to that at all, as tonight, and sing it, although sometimes it's done in a slightly more inventive way. For instance, Matthias Görner and Alfred Brendel recorded Schwanengesang live. Tumultuous applause at the end of Doppelganger, and then they sang Taubenpost as an encore, which is quite a clever idea. Here we're doing it differently. Ian Bostridge will sing some more songs by Seidl in the middle of the evening. And all of these things are possible. I'm just going to highlight a few little details of the songs. There is no system to this at all. I'm just picking up one or two ideas as I go along. The setting of Seidel's Sehnsucht begins very stormily indeed, and forgive me, I can't quite manage stormy on the piano, but moody, dramatic, dark in mood. But what I want to show you is this descending motif in the bass, first of all. All that way going out. And we hear that several times, almost like a ground bass. And so forth and so on. And in the middle parts, of the piano part, you hear a line that imitates the voice. When the voice sings, that's Ich sitze in meinem Kämmerlein. After that's happened in the voice, we go, we have that hidden in the middle of the piano part. And that stormy section continues like that until we reach safer ground with the major key, and that's what persists until the end. It's basically a pure love song, and it's also about singing. He says he can't force a song like the west wind, and near the end, basically it translates as, just look, there's a song here already. So we finally made a song. By Dear a Line is another Seidel song from a collection called Four Refrain Songs, published by Thaddeus Weigel in 1828. And Weigel advertised these songs quite interestingly. He said, for a long time, the public has cherished the desire to have from the pen of this brilliant song composer a composition, for once, of more cheerful comic content. With present four songs, Herr Schubert unexpectedly meets this desire. So look, you all wanted fun stuff, and look, he's written some. He'd be mad not to, frankly. And By Dear a Line is quite a simple song and another quite simple love song. Im Freien has a piano part which consists of repeated semiquavers from end to end. So you hear something approximately like this. Oh, sorry. And so forth and so on. I was researching something quite different recently, and I came across this. In the autobiography of Dame Ethel Smythe, the composer of the late 19th century, she says she was studying in Leipzig. She went home to England. I had been told about a charming newcomer in our neighborhood who was said to be very musical and was looking forward to meeting the Leipzig daughter. Knowing what very musical amounts to in England, expectation did not run high. But on the day she'd been asked to come to lunch, I sat down at the piano just for fun as her dog cart drew up at the door and began playing Im Freien, a Schubert song I was wild about just then. Presently, a very nice-looking woman of the smart, sporting type was ushered in, who cheerfully uttered the words, "Ah, dear old chopsticks." And believe it or not, Ethel actually, if I can find it, yeah, here it is, writes out chopsticks in what she says is the same key. She's using the low voice version in D flat, but she writes out chopsticks for some reason also in 2/4, but in triplets. So it's. And then she follows that with the opening of Im Freien. So please, tonight, don't talk about chopsticks the moment they start to play it, because then I won't be able to enter this building again. But that's a great story, and it's a very interesting song because it sounds like it's a strophic song, but actually all the little musical ideas in the voice part and the piano come back slightly differently each time. So it's a sort of almost a kind of sonata form movement as well as a strophic song. It's very, very subtle kind of minimal composition. Devandra and Monde is just a jolly folk song, but it does feature something I'm going to talk about. That interval, if you spent the whole evening listening for this, I'll be very pleased. That's the interval of a fourth, and it's a very common opening gambit in Schubert, especially in this cycle. There's another thing that I want to draw attention to, which is the use of early dissonance. Schubert is famous for very quickly throwing you in a harmonically surprising direction. So the opening of the C major string quintet starts with a 2-bar crescendo, which you can't do on the piano, but think about this. Louder and louder and louder and louder. That. Now that's highly unusual. There are very few examples of this, but Schubert does it quite a lot. And if I just show you the most striking example in the Atlas, almost straight away we have this. That chord, straight away on the 2nd bar. Now, a boring composer would have done this. A boring composer like me would have done this. G minor. D major. But Schubert keeps the B flat. That chord. Very surprising chord. And he does that throughout the piece. There are several other examples of early dissonance. The best one is in Die Stadt, I think, which never actually resolves. The piano does this, and then now that dissonance, that's technically a diminished 7th chord, never resolves. The song ends. And I defy anyone to say what key that's actually in. And that leaves you hanging in the air, bottom C, and then Amer begins, finally resolving the tension that's being created at the end of the previous song. And in fact, that tension has been there throughout the whole of the previous song. Early dissonance, keep an ear out for something very surprising within a few bars' time. There are one or two other more trivial things that I just want to point out. And this gets mildly technical. Loud in music is forte. Very loud is fortissimo. Very loud is FFF, forte fortissimo. In the early 19th century, that's quite an unusual marking, but there are 3 or 4 examples in Schwanengesang. You think songs designed to be sung at home, round the piano, no one is wanting to be deafened, and of course on a period instrument, an instrument of Schubert's period, you wouldn't be so deafened. But there are places which are marked 3 Fs. And elsewhere in Schubert, when he marks 3 Fs, it's a sign that something is really going wrong, that there's a problem, there's a crisis. End of the Schubert B-flat trio, for instance, first movement, works its way up to a shocking climax, harmonically unstable, 3 Fs, pause, total silence, and then a very tentative restart from the instruments. So it's as if he's looked over the edge of the abyss and doesn't like what he's seen and comes back. You know? So 3 Fs. So if you think that Imogen Cooper is playing very loudly, she is, and she's doing exactly what Schubert is asking us to do. There are other examples of the dissonance thing, and the fourth thing. The interval of the fourth, typically. So that interval of the fourth, you will hear that in the beginning of Liebesbotschaft, Kriegers Ahnung, Ständchen. There we go. Abschied and Der Atlas. It's all over the place. Sometimes it goes down and it seems to mean something different then. But if you just listen out for that interval of the fourth and the early dissonances in the piece within a few bars. I'll just finish. I quoted Richard Capel at the beginning saying there's no sign of Schubert losing his invention at all, it's all fine. And he describes very delightfully how Taubenpost draws on Moravian folk dancing rhythms and things like that. I have no idea if that's true or not. And then he says that it's as if we leave the room dancing and looking forward to the future. So I hope we all look forward to the future, and in the short term, that future includes this evening's concert. So thank you very much for your attention, and have a great evening.